Alex was just a kid, really, fresh out of college, drowning in student debt, and desperate for work. When the ad popped up for an overnight security guard position, guarding an old, decommissioned children's hospital on the edge of town, he jumped at it. The pay was good, the hours were long, and the job seemed simple enough. Patrol the empty corridors, check the locks, make sure no one was breaking in. What could go wrong, right? It was just an old building, gathering dust. Or so he thought. The first time Alex drove up to the place, even in the fading daylight, it gave him the creeps. It was massive, a sprawling brick edifice that looked like it had been plucked straight out of a Gothic novel. Ivy clawed its way up the crumbling walls, like skeletal fingers trying to hold the building together. The windows were dark, vacant eyes staring out at nothing. A rusty sign, barely legible, still read, St. Augustine's Children's Hospital. A shiver, not entirely from the cool evening air, ran down Alex's spine. He tried to shake it off. Just an old building, he told himself, nothing more. His first few shifts were uneventful. Boring, even. He'd walked the labyrinthine hallways, his flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness, illuminating peeling paint, faded murals of cartoon animals, and the occasional dusty, broken toy left behind. The silence was the loudest thing in the place, a heavy, suffocating blanket that swallowed the sound of his own footsteps. He started to get comfortable. He'd bring his headphones, listen to podcasts, scroll through his phone. A bit of an adrenaline junkie, Alex loved a good horror movie, but he was a skeptic at heart. Ghosts, haunted places, that was for fiction. Then, things started to shift, subtly at first. So subtly that Alex dismissed them as his imagination, or just the quirks of an ancient building. Like the time he swore he'd locked the heavy double doors to the old pediatric ward, only to find them slightly ajar an hour later. Or the flickering fluorescent lights in the cafeteria, which would strobe erratically even when he was the only one in that entire wing. He'd hear the building settling, he told himself, the wind rattling loose panes, old pipes groaning. But the sounds grew more distinct. Faint whispers, like dry leaves skittering across linoleum, would sometimes drift from the empty rooms. He'd pause, his heart doing a little jump, convinced he'd heard a child sob, or a distant, off-key lullaby. He'd shine his flashlight into the darkness, its beam trembling slightly, but there was never anything there. Just the dust motes dancing in the light, and the silence, that horrible, pressing silence. There was one floor, the third floor, that always felt colder. Even on warmer nights, a glacial chill would seep into his bones the moment he stepped off the rattling service elevator. This was where the critical care units for the children had been, and a specific room at the very end of the corridor, labeled simply Playroom, had a heavy, rusted lock on it. His supervisor, a grizzled old man named Frank who rarely spoke, had given him a single, stern instruction: never, under any circumstances, try to open the playroom on the third floor. Just don't. Frank hadn't elaborated, and Alex hadn't pushed, but that warning, coupled with the icy dread that emanated from that particular area, stuck with him. As the weeks bled into each other, the isolated incidents began to weave a pattern. One night, while doing his rounds, Alex found a small, worn teddy bear sitting upright on a bed in the pediatric ward. He swore it hadn't been there before. He picked it up, feeling a strange aversion to its faded, button eyes, and placed it on a nearby shelf. The next night, it was back on the bed, then again, and again. Each time, a little closer to the door, a little closer to him. The feeling of being watched became constant, a prickle on the back of his neck, a sense of eyes boring into him from the deeper shadows. He'd catch glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, a fleeting shadow darting around a corner, a flicker of something small disappearing behind a gurney. But every time he whirled around, there was nothing. Just empty space waiting for him. The silence was no longer just silence, it felt like a held breath. He started carrying his heavy-duty flashlight at all times, gripping it like a weapon. His easy skepticism had crumbled, replaced by a raw, primal fear that buzzed just beneath his skin. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford. Every creak in his own apartment sounded like a footstep, every whisper of the wind like a child's voice calling his name. He was tired, jumpy, and utterly alone in that echoing tomb every night. Then came that night. It was a Tuesday, late November. A furious storm raged outside, the wind howling like a banshee and rain lashing against the grimy windows. The old hospital groaned and shuddered, a symphony of creaks and moans that normally would have been dismissed as weather-related. But Alex knew better now. He knew it wasn't just the wind. He was on the second floor, doing his routine check, when the lights flickered violently, then died. The entire building plunged into an inky blackness, only broken by the faint red glow of emergency exit signs and the beam of Alex's flashlight. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The silence that followed the sudden power cut was absolute, broken only by the incessant drumming of rain and the distant, tormented shriek of the wind. He started making his way to the main power panel, his hands slick with sweat, his flashlight beam dancing wildly ahead of him. He rounded a corner, his breath catching in his throat. From the floor above, distinct, undeniable. Tap, tap, tappy small footsteps, not the heavy, uneven tread of a maintenance worker or the shuffling of an old building settling. These were light, rhythmic, like a child skipping, and they were coming from the third floor, from the playroom. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee, to forget his job, and never look back. But a morbid curiosity, a terrifying compulsion, pulled him forward. He had to see, he had to know. He took the service elevator, his stomach churning, the old metal cage creaking and groaning as it slowly ascended to the third floor. When the doors finally shuddered open, the cold hit him like a physical blow. The air was thick, heavy, carrying the faint, sickly sweet smell of decay and something else, something metallic, like old blood. The tappy tap, tap, was louder now, closer. It was definitely coming from the end of the hall, towards the playroom. He gripped his flashlight so tightly his knuckles were white. Each step was an agonizing effort, his shoes sounding like thunder in the suffocating quiet. The emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and stretch with every beat of his frantic heart. He reached the end of the corridor, and there it was. The heavy, rusted lock on the playroom door was gone. The door itself was slightly ajar, a sliver of deeper darkness visible within. The tapping sounds had stopped, replaced by a soft, almost imperceptible creaking. "Hello," Alex's voice cracked, barely a whisper. He knew no one would answer. He knew he didn't want anyone to. He pushed the door open, slowly. The room was just as he remembered it, only darker, dustier. Old, faded toys lay scattered on the floor. A headless doll, a train set derailed, blocks spelling out nonsense words. And in the center, bathed in the weak beam of his flashlight, stood a small wooden rocking horse. It was rocking, gently, rhythmically, back and forth, but there was no one on it, no breeze, just the rocking. A high-pitched giggle, fragile and chilling, echoed from directly behind him, not from the rocking horse, from behind him. Alex spun around, his flashlight beam cutting wildly through the darkness. Nothing. Just the open door, the empty corridor. But the giggle lingered, seeming to swirl around him, growing louder, multiplying. Dozens of tiny voices, whispering, chattering, laughing, all around him, in the air, in the walls, in the very floor beneath his feet. Play with us, forever." He stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, rolling, its beam flickering erratically before settling, pointing directly at the rocking horse. The rocking horse was now rocking wildly, violently, as if a child was thrashing on its back. And then, from beneath it, from the shadows clinging to its carved wooden legs, a small, pale hand shot out. It was tiny, almost translucent, and seemed to glow with an eerie, internal light. It clamped onto Alex's ankle, impossibly cold, its grip like steel. A scream tore from Alex's throat, raw and primal. He thrashed, trying to kick free, but the cold hand held fast. He saw it then, too, not just the hand. A tiny, emaciated arm, barely visible in the gloom, reaching out from beneath the horse. And then two eyes, small and unnervingly bright, peered out from the darkness beneath the horse's belly. Not childlike eyes, ancient, malicious. The whispers intensified, filling his head, deafening him. The rocking horse suddenly stopped, frozen mid-rock, then toppled over with a deafening crash that reverberated through the silent building. The small, pale hand released his ankle. Alex didn't wait. He didn't look back at the playroom, at the shadowy figure that he knew was now fully exposed. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing his flashlight without a second glance, and ran. He ran as he had never run before, down the stairs, through the main lobby, past the deserted reception desk. He didn't bother to sign out, didn't stop for his jacket, didn't even look at the clock. He burst out of the hospital's main doors, the storm still raging, but the cold rain on his face felt like a cleansing fire. He jumped into his car, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely get them into the ignition. He put the car in reverse, tires screeching on the wet asphalt, and sped away, leaving the silent, malevolent building behind him. Alex never went back. He called his supervisor the next morning, quitting on the spot, refusing to elaborate beyond personal reasons. He was never able to articulate the horror he experienced in that playroom. How could he? Who would believe him? The image of that tiny, ice-cold hand, those ancient eyes, the chorus of children's whispers, it was all burned into his memory, a permanent scar on his psyche. He still has trouble sleeping. The dark hallways of his own apartment sometimes feel too long, too quiet. Every distant creak or whisper of the wind makes his heart jump. He's always looking over his shoulder, always expecting to see a small shadow darting just out of sight.